Welcome back, everyone, to Introductory to Ethics at St. Vincent's College. And today I'm going to be covering some basic concepts in Book 6 of Aristotle's Ethics, and a few side notes as well. This is a very general introduction, as I've mentioned before, really not meant for those who are even majoring in philosophy, but even a more basic introduction than that. And I'm hoping to relate some of these concepts as much as I can to everyday experience and to situations that we still think about today. So I will be cutting out, Aristotle goes on a bit of a tangent in the middle and towards the end of the book on differences between things like practical wisdom, political wisdom. There's a number of finer points there. If I were teaching a political theory class, I would certainly cover those things, but I don't really think it's necessary for our purposes. And I will be adding a few supplemental concepts of my own that are not necessarily found in the book. So, which I've done before. So I'm pretty consistent with my style. So we are covering Aristotle's thoughts on intellectual virtue, which needs to be differentiated from moral virtue. Moral virtue, or of course, finding those means, those mediums. Remember, virtue is found in the middle. We've talked about that a fair amount. And acting on them. That's what the moral virtues are essentially, those activities, like courage and generosity, that whole list that he gives, I believe, in book 4. But there's a trouble with this. And Aristotle knows the trouble, or a problem, or certainly an assumption, that, and this is what I've put up here to try to illustrate this. If we are to be morally virtuous, if we are to act rightly, we have to make a choice. Remember all that discussion about voluntary and involuntary actions? And voluntary actions must involve a choice of some kind, a deliberately chosen choice. Okay, it's kind of redundant, but you see what I mean. But of course, in order to make a deliberate choice, that takes mind, right? But here's the problem. What if your mind is not what mind is supposed to be? Uh-oh, you got a problem, right? So this is where Aristotle introduces the concept right away of right reason. In other words, right reason, or dianoia in Greek, dianoia. It literally means to kind of, to think something through, to really break it apart and go through it, okay? Because noia is mind, nous is mind, dia usually means through or alongside, something like that. So reason must be used rightly so that we can actually choose the right mean, the right moral mean or middle ground. So does that make some sense to everybody? So, and Aristotle understands this quite well. And this is why he has an entire chapter on intellectual virtue. It is again one of the more difficult chapters, which we'll go into as much as we can without getting drowning too much in some of the concepts. But it stands to reason that, and Aristotle has a bit of a digression on the parts of the soul again. And he does this because particularly the rational part of our soul is divided into parts as well. And when I say parts, or when Aristotle says parts, he doesn't mean divisible parts. He means something like parts of, concave or convex, like they go together. Or in the same way that, say, you have a square, or this is a rectangle, I guess. And if I were to draw a line, of course, down the side, virtually speaking, there are two triangles there, right? But I can't really say that two triangles are part of this rectangle. I can say it, I sort of can say it, and at the same time, not. So it's just important to realize it's not as if there's almost physical parts to the soul. That's a very simplistic way of looking at things, and it's not what Aristotle means. But in an introduction to philosophy, those are things to bring up. He mentions that there are two kind of different basic sorts of reasoning in the rational part of the soul. Okay, and the reason why he brings up the soul at the beginning is because we're talking about intellectual virtue. Well, it would stand to reason that if there are different parts, quote unquote, of the rational soul, then those parts would have different virtues to them. In other words, the virtue or the mean of scientific reasoning would be slightly or very different than the virtue or the mean of calculative reason. Okay, so he's more or less getting into kinds of right reason is where most of the discussion is going. And Aristotle's at pains to try to explain what is meant by right reason. And of course, there's different ways in which we think about things. And we'll talk about some of these ways as we go. Generally speaking, the scientific part of the soul understands and is directed towards first principles, definitions, terms, really the things that thought is based on is what scientific reasoning is really aimed at. What we would still call science would fall into this category, mathematics, things like that. But there's also calculative reason. Scientific reason, Aristotle would define as those things which cannot be otherwise, is a phrase that he uses. Those things which are eternal, necessary truths. But calculative reason deals with things that might be otherwise. So when we're dealing with practical matters, when we're dealing truly with making moral decisions, practical wisdom, prudence, we've talked about that before. That is really what Aristotle's talking about, broadly speaking, with calculative reason, okay? With the irrational part of the soul, and again, there are reasons why Aristotle's bringing this up. The irrational part of the soul is supposed to listen to the rational part of the soul like a good child listens to a good parent. Okay? Hi, Mary. Okay. We have virtual people here. Okay, so is supposed to, but does the irrational part of the soul always do that? No. That really is one of the problems, okay? That the two parts of the irrational soul are our desires, our passions, and our vegetative nature, nutrition, growth, our heartbeat, things that do not involve choice per se. If somebody punches me, if something like that happens, do we make a choice to be angry? Initially, no, not really. It's a reaction. There are a number of things that our passions, they just kind of do on their own. Now, can we be habituated to act differently? Yes, we can. Aristotle's at pains to talk about that. And that needs to be done from the time that you're a child, ideally, okay? But, or things like functions in the soul. It's a darn good thing that I don't have to make a choice for every breath I take and every heartbeat I make. Well, that sounds like a Sting song, doesn't it? I'm sorry, I'm just having a little fun. Philosopher joke. So I don't make decisions about all those things. This is what the rational part of the soul does. And ultimately, Aristotle is going to make the primary point that he's repeated, in fact, a number of times, that usually what gets in the way of right reason, you can certainly be inculcated with false opinions. That is very true. But very often what happens is that desire, that this part of the soul ends up overruling this part. This gets the best of us most of the time. If something goes wrong, that is. Usually what happens is that our passions are getting the better of us, okay? So I'm just trying to give you the logic, or some of the logic, of why Aristotle is talking about some of the things that he's talking about. He talks about the parts of the soul here for a reason. He's trying to talk about what kinds of rationality there are. And also he wants to talk about the parts of the soul that sometimes overrule the rational part of the soul, okay? And this is quite important to remember. This is a kind of a very key, that in order to make moral decisions, we must make choices. Choices must be deliberate, which means they have to come from mind. We have to deliberate, right? That's what the mind does, is deliberate. It calculates, okay? But that can go awry. We have to have right reason in order to make the correct moral choices. So very much, this is an objective way of looking at of truth and goodness. In other words, how we should act and how we should think. Aristotle is very much an objective thinker because he is very much assuming, and he's proven this, I think, in different places, that there is such a thing as right reason. Now, would every philosopher agree with the fact that there is such a thing as right reason? No. Okay, absolutely not. I think a really good foil for Aristotle, a kind of opposite, would be Thomas Hobbes, for example. We talked about Thomas Hobbes with social contract theory. Thomas Hobbes, remember, he essentially holds that reality of humankind is pretty much in a state of war of all against all. And in order to hopefully mitigate that, to achieve a certain level of peace, we can get together and kind of elect or contract a sovereign, a king, a tyrant even, who has power to enforce laws over us. Aristotle really, or excuse me, Hobbes really believes that human reason, that we're just clever animals, more or less. That just like a monkey trying to reach into a tree and grab out some goodies in there, that he maybe can figure out how to use a tool. That human beings are really, that's what our reason is. All we're doing is manipulating one another with our thoughts to try to get what we want. That's what reason is for Hobbes. I'm possibly slightly overstating that, but I might not be. But he more or less says that. That's completely the opposite of what Aristotle is trying to say. That thought aims at an object. And I know I've talked about this before, but it stands to reason that we should go over it again because it's that important. Every power that we have is ordained towards an object, right? I left off the T. I didn't have any room. And a good example of that is that we have the power of sight. Well, the power of sight isn't random. The power of sight is ordained towards the visible. That power has a proper object. And all of our powers, the power to grow. I mean, our cells dividing. I mean, it's ordained towards growth, ordained towards life. There's an object to that power. Well, we need to rationally extend that we have this amazing power of intellect. And if this is true, and the intellect is a power, then it must be ordained towards something real. Otherwise, why make an exception for our intellect when we're not making an exception for powers like sight and hearing or any number of other powers that we have? That doesn't really make much sense, certainly not to Aristotle. So what the intellect is ordained towards is something that we call truth. The proper object of mind is truth. And when the intellect finds truth, the pathway that it uses is right reason. When reason is being used correctly. Now, I know that it's like, good heavens, what does that mean? I can't cover everything in this. That's it's really a massive discussion, isn't it? But I think that I wanted to reiterate that Aristotle is certainly a very objective thinker here. He is assuming that there truly is such a thing as truth. But I think that the argument that I just made, which is really an argument that he makes, at least implicitly, Thomas Aquinas makes it explicitly, that our intellect is geared, ordained towards something quite real. Unlike Hobbes says, where this power that we have, our intellect, really isn't, the only thing it's ordained for is manipulation, for us to just get what we want and try to not be killed and try to not have our things stolen, which is a fairly bleak way of looking at humankind. And later, Aristotle will admit that there are certain cultures that can be very brutish, where Hobbes's depiction of things might at least look a little bit more true. It might not be ultimately true about the human person, but because of cultural difference or any number of things, you may have a society where Hobbes makes a lot more sense, unfortunately. Okay, and that's the sort of discussions that you can get into, particularly in political theory classes. Is if if those people that are listening are younger people, you're still thinking about a major political theory covers questions like that. It's very, very fascinating. So I wanted to get into a few kind of sidebars. There's one point where Aristotle mentions that knowledge presupposes a likeness between subject and object. And wow, is that a momentous statement. It's difficult to describe to you how important of a statement that actually is. Wait, could we pause there? Because I want to look up something. Okay, now the place where this sentence is mentioned, it's page 147 in the Oswald version, but this would be the Becker number, 1139A, 9 and 10, around there. So it says, for if we grant that knowledge presupposes a certain likeness of kinship of subject and object, there will be a generically different part of the soul naturally corresponding to each of two different kinds of object. Now, do you remember that's a mouthful, and there's a bunch of assumptions going on there that I'm going to just try to very briefly explain, because it's incredibly important for the history of philosophy. Okay, you remember those two parts of the soul, the rational parts, the calculative and the scientific. Each one of those has its proper object, like what I talked about before. Each power has a different object. The object of the scientific part of the soul are really first principles, definitions, terms, eternal truths. Whereas the proper object of the deliberative or calculative part of the soul are really calculating the means to certain ends, trying to figure things out in the practical world. So those are different objects. And this statement, this statement about the kinship between subject and object is an epistemological statement. That's a mouthful. Okay, epistemology is what Aristotle is talking about. Epistemology is the philosophical study of how we come to know things. Okay, it's very, very important. It's very, very important study. Analogously, we have like metaphysics would be the study of the absolute constitutive principles of reality itself. The political philosophy, the study of how we come together as human beings and create laws and how we actually get along with one another or fail to do so. And the list goes on and on. So epistemology is specifically how we come to know things. I'm going to give you a very terrible, very short explanation of this. That any philosopher who's actually watching this is going to see that there are gaps. Okay, but for the sake of argument, I think that it's at least, I'm just trying to show you a sketch. Okay. Think about this for a second. We sometimes fail to recognize how spiritual a power the intellect is. It is truly amazing what the intellect is capable of doing. If we were immortal, and in the Christian tradition, because essentially we are, okay, that our soul will go on and on, we are capable of knowing, our capability to know things is essentially endless. We could continue to learn things for all eternity. That's just one point. Another point is that, and we do this so often that we take it for granted. There is out here a real world, a world of objects, a world of relationships, colors, sounds, all sorts of things. For the sake of argument, let's just call it the real world. I do not know, and this will sound silly, but hopefully you'll see the point I'm trying to make. I do not come to know this book by shoving it in my head. And I mean, there's no relationship between the concepts of my mind and this object. They're very different. But here Aristotle is saying, if we grant that knowledge presupposes a certain likeness and kinship of subject and object, in other words, a certain relationship between mind and what it's thinking, that's how we come to know things. There is a process by which we come to know things. And this is more or less, it's described in a fair amount of detail, particularly by Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologia. And this is where, this is just a broad, kind of a very broad sketch. That what the power that the intellect has, it is able to look at an object and in a certain sense create a sort of picture of it, a kind of copy. And that's called a phantasm. And please realize that you can, there's whole libraries full of books on this process. So, and what the intellect does is it draws what's called the intellectual species from that object. In other words, this is a process, it's called abstraction, okay? Abstraction. Abstraction means to pull out of. The mind is so incredible, so spiritual, so powerful. It is able to picture things, kind of copy them, and then draw from them their intelligible content. In other words, I can see this. My mind is picturing it. That's the phantasm. But I may have no idea what this is. Say I came from another planet and I was actually a human being, just say for the sake of argument. But they don't have any books on their planet. This would have no intelligible content for them. They could see what it is, but they couldn't jump from the picture in their mind to book. They couldn't understand what it is and what it's for. Okay, but the mind we can figure, do you realize how much is happening? How many millions of relationships that we are making constantly? All the memories that are active whenever we look at all sorts of objects. When we read, we're constantly making connections. Just thousands upon thousands of ideas stringing together and coming up with what we would call, hopefully, truth. When it strings together those ideas well. Okay, so In other words, what Aristotle is talking about is this amazing process by which a spiritual power, mind, can kind of convert objects into itself. I mean, just think about it this way. My mind is that power by which I can take the whole world and put it in here. Wow. I mean, that's a very real statement. That if I live forever, I could continue that process and put the whole world, endless relationships and bits of knowledge in here. And that power by which I act on the world, I go out from myself and kind of impress myself upon the world, that is my will. That is my power of choice. Interesting, isn't it? So intellect is that process by which the whole world can come in here. And then the whole world that's in me can go out to the world out here. And life, what we call life, is this constant flow, almost like the tide between the two, constantly. And it's an incredible thing when we meet another human being. That's the reason why human beings are just so awesome. Every single human being that you meet is a whole world. And that's a fascinating thing. Okay, and Aristotle is very much in favor of the idea that we can, in the same way that, if I put on green and speckled glasses, well, I'm going to see the world in a slightly skewed way, am I not? I'm going to see it green and speckled, okay? And that would be that some opinion or some rogue desire, some passion is clouding my right reason. And if that happens, then I cannot correctly find the virtuous mean, the middle, okay? It's deep stuff here, huh? And some of this is, Aristotle does not go into some of the things that I mentioned. He implies them, but this epistemological point, he does talk about in this chapter 1. And it's such an important point for the history of philosophy that I think that this is a good spot to at least make you aware of it. This is called the process of abstraction, and it is found in epistemology. If you would like to look that up yourself, you're certainly welcome to do so. So I know that that's quite a mouthful, and I need to pause again to write something on the board. Another thing that is quite important, which was similar to what I had in the middle before, similar but not exactly the same, is Aristotle mentions that there are 3 elements, 3 dimensions that lead to action and truth. 3 elements in the soul that lead to action and truth. This is what I have written over here. That one is our sense. You also might, it's in Greek, it's aesthesis, our perception of things. So our sense or our perception of things. Our perception of things, of course, is mediated by our senses, right? That's how we perceive. We perceive by our senses. Also the intellect, which is different than sense, because it's the intellect's job to sort what it receives from the senses, to try to figure it out, to try to name it, to try to attach concepts to it. That's what intellect does. It's really what we've been talking about this whole time. And desire, our passions, the things that can either drive us to great heights or plummet us to great depths. And I think, honestly, if I were to, and this is a little bit more of a point of Thomas Aquinas, but I actually think that Aristotle makes it as well. I would rewrite this. There's a reason why I'm rewriting this. Sense, desire, then intellect. Anybody want to take a stab at why I might have switched their place? No? Okay. Desire is in a bit of a middle place between sense and intelligence, for the reason that some of our desires are actually intellectual desires. The desire for meaning, the desire for truth, the desire for goodness. These are very, very pleasant, positive, and good desires. And they make sense, okay? Now, properly speaking, Aristotle is still places desire in the irrational part of the soul. There's some arguments in the history of philosophy about whether or not that is entirely the case. But I think it's worth mentioning. So some desires make sense, and some, of course, do not. Some of them are very irrational, and can kill us. They can destroy us and others when desires go too awry. Aristotle also mentions something that I think is interesting. He says that animals do not act. Animals do not act, properly speaking. Do you know why he might say that?
Do they respond rather than act?
That would be true. They respond. They respond to stimuli. In other words, animals, for the most part, are determined creatures. I've mentioned before, something like a bear, lion, any animal cannot wake up and decide that it's not going to be like a dog or a bear, or it can't do that. There's a determinism there, even though, of course, they can be somewhat unpredictable. But guess what? Being unpredictable is part of their nature. In other words, their unpredictability is predictable. Maybe a clever way of saying it, or maybe not so clever. But a human being, properly so called, only a human being truly acts. In other words, only a human being uses intelligence to make a voluntary choice. This is why that chapter on voluntary and involuntary action is absolutely key to understanding the entire edifice of Aristotle's ethics. And this choice leads to action. Well, animals can't choose, therefore they can't act. I mean, that's a pretty sound syllogism, isn't it? But that, in other words, Aristotle certainly doesn't mean that animals can't do things. Of course they can. That's ridiculous. But the way that it is defined in morality, in virtue ethics, only a human being can act. So I think that is a point that's worth making. and also worth making, that in order to truly arrive at truth in action, okay, truth in action is what? It's virtue.
That's what we were saying. Not fast enough.
Truth in action is virtue. Okay. So, what this little diagram means, and this is, I don't know, in a certain sense it's bad news, and in a certain sense it's good news, that in order to have truth in action or real virtue, the intellect must be true, desire must be directed in the proper direction, and the perception must be clear. All three they have to form a kind of choir together in order to truly arrive at right reason, which decides the proper moral action to take. Okay? So, now the bad news, you know, those stories, it's like, you want the good news first or the bad news? Okay. The bad news is that even Aristotle will admit this is hard, real hard, if not impossible in many circumstances. And that true virtue, where all of it kind of gets together, is rare. That's why he makes so much of the prudent human being, which he calls the spoudios, the truly internally well-organized, temperate, prudent human being, that in every circumstance, or almost every circumstance, with the right people, in the right way, with the right actions, and at the right time, their sense is clear, their desire is well-directed, and their intelligence is pure and white-hot. Okay? This is not easy. And referring to really this phenomenon, St. Thomas Aquinas, I know I mention him a lot. That's because Thomas Aquinas is the chief figure after Christ that incorporates Aristotle's thought into Western thought. So it's not that he's just my favorite philosopher. He's certainly one of them, but he is Aristotelian. So I mention him for a reason. That Thomas Aquinas will say that life, I wonder if I have room to write this, right? Life is a bonum, if you can see this, arguably. Life is a bonum in Latin. Now, this is not Greek, it's Latin. Life is an arduous good, is what Thomas Aquinas will say. That life is a beautiful thing, but it's hard, because getting all three of these to truly act in harmony with each other is the combat of a lifetime. It truly is. So I think that is a point worth mentioning in an introductory class. I also, before we go, want to touch on the 5 different spheres of right reason, I guess. That, as I mentioned before, there are different parts of the soul. Very broadly, Aristotle divides them into the scientific and the calculative, right? Well, there's a few more subcategories, shall we say? Okay, and the calculative, I believe he would put both art and practical wisdom within calculative. but I know he would put practical wisdom. I'm not entirely certain about art. So don't quote me on that one necessarily. But I wanted to at least go through these. And again, there's entire dissertations written on each one of these figures. So like, can you see? So the first one is art. Art is not aimed at action. Art is aimed at production. Art is aimed at not necessarily the right sort of thought, but about producing something. Now, this could mean something of utility, or it could mean something truly beautiful in the sense of a painting or a dance, a work of poetry, what we would normally call art. But Aristotle would also include within this just handiwork, someone that can build a good desk, someone that could weave a good basket, someone that could make a good saddle for a horse. What is the standard of how true art is? That's an incredibly important question to ask. The standard for things like the productive arts, things like saddle making, basket weaving, all those sorts of things is, well, is it useful? Is it useful? Does it work? And you would say that if a fellow kept making desks that fall apart, then his art is not true. That is what Aristotle would say. The truth of his art, it does not rise to the standard of right reason. At least what right reason would be for art. There's a specific kind of right reason for art. And there's a specific kind of right reason for each one of these. All of them, in other words, there's different, all of these have different objects. That's what's absolutely important to understand. That's why, one of the reasons why I mentioned this whole thing about each power being directed towards an object. One of my points is that the power of the intellect has an object, which is truth. But there are subcategories to that. Each one of these is directed towards a certain kind of truth. Okay? Is that more clear? So art is aimed at a certain kind of production. Now, with art, the way that we would normally consider art, like painting, poetry, is it beautiful? And that's beauty is a very mysterious quality. We can't really get into it right now because that would take an entire talk in and of itself. But that is a massive argument in modern art today. Are there truly standards for what is beautiful, or does anything go? Okay, and Aristotle, you know what he would say. You know what he would say. If Aristotle looked at a great deal, I think, of modern art today, he would be positively mystified and just not know what we're talking about. And there would be other kinds that he would recognize. No, this is truly beautiful. This is, I can see what this is. I can feel it's the power of its beauty, so to speak. So science is really the same, more or less the same way that we would still use science. It is directed towards imperishable and eternal truths. Those things that can or cannot or should not be otherwise, cannot be otherwise. True knowledge, a body of knowledge, in the same way that physics is, or biology, or truly seeking out the truth of a particular object to where it makes a coherent a coherent body of knowledge that we call science. Now, practical wisdom, we've gone over a good bit, and I've already mentioned this. Practical wisdom is concerned about means, concerned not about ends, the ends of life, the goals, the ultimate goals, is really something that theoretical wisdom is after. You know, the big questions, like what is life all about? What's the meaning of life? Who is God? I mean, this is the highest form of intellectual activity, according to Aristotle. This, in Greek, theoretical wisdom the Greek word is Sophia. And, you know, philosophia is the love of wisdom. So true wisdom is Sophia. He puts this at the top. Okay. And the truly wise man, the truly wise woman really knows what all of this is for, and can put all of the puzzle pieces together. Now, he or she might not know some of the particulars of mathematics or biology, but he knows what it's for. He knows where it goes in a decent, good human life. Okay? That's what theoretical wisdom does. Practical wisdom, so practical wisdom doesn't figure out, well, what's the meaning of life? No. That's the object of theoretical wisdom. Practical wisdom is, okay, no, I have this situation here before me. I have these 6 people fighting, and XYZ is going to happen if they continue fighting. How do I manage to the most justice and the most peace in this particular situation? That's a means, that's not an end. Aristotle takes it for granted that the end, of course, should be just. It should be prudent. It should be good. That's the end. But the practical woman, the practical man, figures out how to get there. That's the object of practical wisdom. Okay? The object of intelligence is to really get at those first principles that everything is based on. Ultimate metaphysical principles, principles like the principle of non-contradiction, you may have heard about. You just look that up, that, you know, A can't equal B. One thing cannot be another thing in the same respect, at the same time, in the same way. These fundamental principles of reality that we almost know by intuition. It's a kind of very pure knowledge that intuits the first principles of all reality, okay? Which we can see is different than science. It's not exactly a body of knowledge. It's kind of like pure IQ, the ability to understand ultimate things. It's certainly not art, and it's very much not practical wisdom, but practical wisdom would be based on, like, if you don't have some intelligence, Aristotle would certainly say you're not going to have practical wisdom. You can't be a complete dingbat, okay, and have practical wisdom. Now, and theoretical wisdom, as I've already explained, is really the ability to put it all together as a coherent whole and understand the ends of human life, the goals of human life, the telos. Basically, understand what we studied in book 1 of the ethics. It's the wise woman, the wise man that truly understands those things, okay? So those are some different ways or different dimensions where right reason can be used, or of course it can go astray. Desire or sense or some false opinion can get in there and wreck the truth of all five of these. Or maybe, and Aristotle would admit that there are certain individuals, he admits several times that we have different temperaments and that we are born with them, and that different human beings on this planet have different abilities in one or another of these five, which is I think kind of fascinating. I think that we've all met people that were pure brain, but they don't know how to tie their shoes. Okay. Lots of intelligence, but practically speaking, don't know how to wash their clothes. The list could go on. Okay. So we've met people like that before. There's certainly people that could have incredible scientific knowledge, but again, not know much about the practicalities of life, be very socially awkward. We've seen this. There are some people that have theoretical wisdom. This could be like the theoretical wisdom without much knowledge of this. My grandfather, he had a 6th grade education, but the man, he was very wise. He knew some stuff about life, but he certainly wasn't gifted with science. And of course, art is really almost in its own category, because it's aimed at a kind of production, right? So it's just kind of a Reader's Digest version of different ways in which we can use our right reason, or in which right reason could fail. Now, I kind of want to end here, and this is not in the book. Oh, one last point. Aristotle talks a good bit, he does talk. These are lecture notes, so I guess I could say that he does talk a lot about practical wisdom and a lot about political wisdom, prudence. They're all very related, those things, but they're not quite the same thing. And there are several chapters in this book where Aristotle's at some pains to differentiate between them. What we have to remember is that the ethics is a kind of prelude to another work, namely the Politics. That Aristotle wants to provide a kind of practical manual for how politicians and how true philosophers should direct themselves. So it's very much stands to reason that he wants to talk about practical knowledge, prudence, political wisdom. He's very convinced that politics is the master science. And he does call it a science. Some people disagree with that. That politics correctly understood, okay, all of these. Normally, when we think of politics today, we think it's a big mess for the most part. But Aristotle says, no, it should be a science, because there's a right way to perceive things. There are correct desires, there's correct truth, thus correct choices, which lead to correct actions. And politicians, more than anyone, need to understand this, or that they are not only going to misguide themselves, but others on a macro level. So he doesn't even want to talk about politics until you get down to basics. If you're not a good man, a good woman, you shouldn't proceed to the politics. Aristotle doesn't want you to touch it. I think for obvious reasons, but we're in a bit of a mess because maybe we didn't take Aristotle's advice on that. I don't know. That's a whole nother can of worms. But I want to complete this by talking, because I do think it's consistent again with our topic, because we are talking about truth. We are talking about intellectual virtue. So this is not really included in this book, but a kind of a postscript that I'm giving. When we think of truth in our modern society, maybe this is a better way of asking, who do we think are the experts in our society? Who are the real experts? When we think about experts, normally, and my class, really several of them kind of said it at the same time, are the scientists. The scientists normally were like, okay, he's a physicist, he's a great biologist, really must know what he's talking about. And those are the quote unquote experts. But, and I'm talking about kinds of truth here. I'm talking about what's included on this middle board here. How many decisions per day do you base on scientific truth? Probably virtually none. Every day? I mean, we certainly do. I mean, maybe when it comes to certain decisions about our health and a few other things, of course, we incorporate scientific truth into our lives. But isn't that a fascinating thing that we consider as the experts in our, and strangely enough, we think that a modern physicist, for example, and this is happening a lot, knows lots about God and whether or not he exists. Now, as a philosopher and a monk, I have a little bit of a problem with that. Because that seems to me that would be like me talking about nuclear physics. And that's not a good idea, because I don't know a lot about nuclear physics. And I'm being a tiny bit facetious here, but I'm trying to get you to understand a point. Philosophy should be about stopping and thinking about these things. That's what I'm trying to make you do. Our moral decisions, that is this good for me? Is this bad for me? Those are things, now we ask those questions every day. Every day. I mean, are there other kinds of truth other than scientific truth? And I would like to just give you a few different ways of looking at this. There's certainly something, I'll go to this one, pragmatic truth. We actually use this all the time. Pragmatic truth is what works, what makes sense. And it might not even make sense. Actually, it's better just to say what works. Case in point, let's say you are a mean-spirited, angry person. And I'm sorry if you are, okay. But you figure out real quickly that treating other people meanly and angrily doesn't work very well for you, because you stop getting the stuff that you want. People stop talking to you. People stop relating to you. They stop giving you goods and services because you are an irascible person. No one wants to be around you. And so even if you're not morally making certain choices to be kind and gentle, I guarantee you will do it because it's pragmatic. You will. Okay. And I think that there's an argument for, and I don't think that this is refutable, being kind and charitable and gentle and merciful with other people just works a heck of a lot better. I mean, it makes society go better. It makes our lives more pleasant. I mean, you would have to be, I think, somewhat of a sociopath if you were to fundamentally disagree with that. I think that that's simply pragmatically demonstrable. If that's true, then maybe that's true. Do you see what I'm saying? If it's pragmatic and just works better to be virtuous, then maybe, just maybe, that is objectively true. Amazing. Okay, do you see what I'm trying to say? If it works, if it truly works in freedom and in goodness, maybe it's a real thing. Okay, maybe it's a real thing. And maybe truth is something objective in the moral realm and not just in the scientific realm. Other truths, and we actually base quite a lot on this, even if it's somewhat unconscious or subconscious. Our narrative truth. There is a certain story that we tell about our lives and about the lives of those around us. There's a certain story that we believe about the world and maybe how it came to be. We base a lot of our behavior on the story that we tell. Is that scientific? It's not scientific at all. But here's where, and some of this, it was recently actually the psychologist Jordan Peterson, the absolute, I think, gem of Canada, okay, or one of them. He's a very brilliant thinker. I mean, you may disagree with him on some aspects, but he mentioned this, and that's why I put it there. Most people would say that narrative truth, if I ask the question, which one is more true, scientific truth or narrative truth? Many people would immediately say, well, scientific truth, well, it's provable. Maybe not. Okay. One point that Jordan Peterson makes is that if we construct our entire lives on particular stories, archetypal stories, stories that have been told since the beginning of time, that maybe narrative truth is the most true truth of all. That there's an incredible truth to the stories that we tell. Now, this gets into some deep waters here, okay? And that can be misunderstood, what I'm saying, because it's not just any story that's true. There are conditions to, I guess, the objective quality of these stories. But I'm just making, and I can't go into that point. It's beyond the scope of my argument. The point I'm trying to make is that this could be as true or more, certainly in the practical realm or the psychological realm, as this. And we often don't think about it that way. But what I'm trying to get you to understand is that the conception of truth is much wider and really more beautiful than just mere facts. I mean, yuck. You want to just live your life by mere facts? You're probably a pretty boring, insufferable person. We human beings are far more than that. And finally, familiar truth. This was the best word I could think about in the, I guess, the final analysis. By familiar, and many people live this way. When asked why they are doing what they are doing, they will simply respond, that's the way I learned it, or that's the way my parents do it. That's the way my family does it. And they really haven't asked about their story, and they haven't really gone into the science of it. And they're not even really asking what works. That's just what they know. Many people operate this way. Now, it is not necessarily the best way to operate for obvious reasons. Because, of course, there could be in your culture or your family, wherever you're getting these truths, deep-seated mistakes in sense, desire, and intellect, right? And if you're living by sheer familiarity, that means you're not really using your mind very much to take things apart, okay? And Aristotle would not like that at all because he takes everything apart, okay? So the truth is a big thing. The truth is a wondrous thing, and it should transcend the little scientific or fact-oriented boxes that sometimes we place it in. Philosophical truth. This is what we answer with philosophy. Philosophy is concerned with far more than fact. Philosophy is concerned with the theoretical. Why are we here? What does life mean? Who is God? What is a good action? What is a bad action? These are fundamentally human questions that we have asked for thousands of years, and I certainly hope we'll ask for thousands of years to come. And thank you very much. Until next time.